Okay, welcome everyone to this week's edition of History Matters, and I've already forgotten 169.
Yes.
Okay, I'm telling you, I forget everything. That's why I'm a historian. History matters, and so does coffee. And history matters, and so does coffee in one right there. So today we're talking about, I think the title I gave it was Censure, Expunging, and Insults. Oh my.
Yeah, that was a good one.
There's just a lot happening this week, and it was literally drifting off to sleep when I saw one of those three things go drifting by on a computer screen, and I was like, really? Like, all in 1 week? Like, what is a historian of members of Congress behaving badly supposed to do with a day like today? So I even came up with the topic earlier than normal.
Yes.
But oops, and I have to close chat or you guys will distract me. Okay. But before I launch into whatever I want to talk about, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I am delighted to be with you, as always, to engage in these conversations with our community here that meets every Friday. We already have a very active chat going if you're tuning in through Zoom. But if you have questions over the next half hour, as Joanne discusses this week's topic, we would really appreciate if you could put those in the Q&A. I'll be looking for those in about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a really wonderful discussion about it.
Wonderful. And if there's someone who's here for the first time, as ever, I will say, make sure chat is set to whatever it is, everyone, all attendees, whatever the magical phrase is, and tell people you're here for the first time, and you will receive a robust welcome from the wonderful History Matters community. It's been meeting here for 169 weeks. Okay, so censuring, expungement, insults. There was a lot that happened this last week. Adam Schiff was censured. There was a little incident on the House floor in which apparently Marjorie Taylor Greene went over to Lauren Boebert and called her a little bitch, I think. I wanted to get actual video of that, but I think she went over to her. So perhaps there is a video of that stellar moment of the history of Congress. And then there was discussion of wanting to, on the part of both, I think. Oh no, that was impeachment. Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene wanted to impeach President Biden. Then I believe separately, maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene talked about expunging the impeachment from the record. Okay, so all stellar moments that deserve to be discussed here among us and open for questions. I did, as ever, after you've done this 169 times, the odds are I have talked about this in some way before, and I did at some point last year talk about censuring in and of itself, and what it's supposed to be and why it's supposed to be humiliating. Today, I'm taking a different approach, and that's explicitly because of these three things put together. The censure, the whole desire to expunge the record of the impeachment, and a slightly lesser degree, but still, the insult. The tack I want to take today, or the part of this that interests me and that I'm going to be talking about, is the performative component of this, right? Because, and I've talked before about the fact that in some ways Congress is a reactive institution. It's also a performative institution, and thoughts about that and what it means go all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, when there was great concern that reporters or the press would be able to see what was going on in Congress, because if they couldn't, I think Jefferson is the one who says, if no one can see what's going on there, it will be the most corrupt institution on the face of the earth, which is a paraphrase, but true in meaning. Jefferson's going to have a moment today apart from that. At any rate, the idea that Congress in some way or another, and not always the same for the House and the Senate, but that it should be open in some way to the public, in part for, if there were a bingo card today, this might be on it, accountability, right? That if people know they have an audience, members of Congress know they have an audience, in some way, ideally, that will affect what they do in a positive way. However, it can also affect what they do in a negative way because they're performing. And of course, it's a complex audience, right? They're performing to the public, they're performing to the press, they're performing to their particular base, they're performing to their opponents generally, they're performing to their colleagues, they're performing to potential allies. If you're in Congress on the floor speaking, it's a complicated audience. It's a big audience. And some members of Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, take advantage of that big audience all the time by standing up and saying things. I won't put an adjective there. I'll hold my adjective back. At any rate, the audience is part of what I want to talk about today, because that's a lot of what's going on in Congress. Obviously, we don't see. It's happening in committee rooms, it's happening behind the scenes, it's happening in conversations. And actually, in my book, I talk about that distinction somewhat. And I talk about how you go off the floor and who the heck knows what happens off the floor, and that committee rooms were considered in some ways deep, dark holes in this time period, because anything could happen in a committee room because there was no audience. So there was no telling, would somebody pull a gun? Would somebody punch somebody? Would there be a threat of some kind? Would there be bad politics engaged in? All kinds of things could happen behind the scenes. And the performative aspect, again, an idea that goes way back, certainly was true in the period I've written about. And a great example of that is John Quincy Adams after his presidency, when he goes back to the House, and Henry Wise of Virginia, and they are sort of against each other, pitted against each other during the time when they're both in the House. And there was one incident, and I talk about it somewhere in that book, in which Henry Wise and John Quincy Adams are going at it, and I think Wise is insulting Adams, and they're, he's in full Henry Wise form, which is being loud and insulting and sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Bravado, and sort of strutting around in a sort of, I'm a Virginian kind of a way, very performative. And then Adams notes this and then says in his diary, and then Wise came to me behind the scenes and said, "You think there's any way we could work a deal out about this?" So there's a really clear way in which some of what goes on the floor is performative. Now, I'm not saying that the violence and the threats and the intimidation are all performative. If they were just fake, they would not have a very big impact. They cause people to back down, they cause people to resign from committees, they cause all kinds of trouble, in part because of the people being intimidated and threatened. So I definitely don't want to give the impression that all the stuff I've written about, it's all fake. No, everyone knew nothing bad would happen. That's The Field of Blood. The title comes from what somebody called the floor of the Senate, the Field of Blood, because things happened there, or they might happen there, at any rate. But the audience, the performative component, mattered a lot. And what that means is sometimes, and these are the people I write about in my last book, people would behave badly in Congress because they knew they had an audience and they were appealing to some aspect of that audience. And so, there were, again, in the period I write about, there were speeches called Buncombe, Buncombe speeches, because is it Buncombe, North Carolina, I believe. There was a member of Congress from Buncombe who would get up and make these outrageous, screaming, flaming, accusatory speeches. And he would essentially say to Congress, "This is just for the folks in Buncombe, so you can ignore this." Now, the problem with that is that he may say that, but people are hearing him issue all of these insults and extreme claims, and they would be riled up by it. So my congressman with the wonderful name David Outlaw at one point in a letter to his wife says, "I hate Buncombe days." Buncombe days, bad things are going to happen because people are in full performance mode. But that performative component matters. Now, and I do want to say something. Actually, I have it scribbled down here, and I might come back to it, but I want to say it in case I don't come back to it because it irks me. So in talking about the three things we're focusing on today and their history, censuring, expunging, and then insult tossing around, I want to discourage us from describing whatever is happening between Greene and Boebert as a cat fight. That's so belittling. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, sexist. Like, oh, those women, they're like having a scratch fight, no. Just don't call it a cat fight. It's a fight. It's an argument. Any number of words you can use. Cat fight to me really drives me up a tree, because it's like, it's not a real fight. It's a woman fight. So forgive me if I've set someone off, if I've triggered someone with that, but I guess in a way that kind of triggers me regardless. So some people are performing for their public, and they're being deliberately loud and accusatory and obnoxious for the people that they particularly want to appeal to. And certainly that's a lot of what Marjorie Taylor Greene does in Congress, is perform loudly and in an accusatory way, because she knows it'll get press, and she knows it'll get attention, and she gets support for it. So, she's rewarded for that kind of behavior. Now, the problem with that is, and I'm going to swing back and talk a little bit about censures and expunging in history. The problem with that kind of standing up and making that kind of claim is, how do you correct it afterwards, right? Sometimes the performance, and we have examples of this every day, the performance takes over, and there's no way you can undo the performance. I'll get back to that regarding expungement, because that's going to be a really important point. But at any rate, I want to talk specifically about all of these things. I said on Twitter regarding censure, the thing about censoring someone is very often it backfires. Excuse me for a sec. It backfires because the person being censored, sometimes it's just unjust, right? And it's just partisan or personal, performative, in which someone is saying, yeah, like, we're going to censor you because we don't like what you did, which is essentially what just happened. So there's a performative component to it. Now, sorry, I'm still looking. I'm on every social media platform in the world, and I still look at what's going on at Twitter, because that's just a useful place to make political commentary, as much as I hate to say that. And I saw what you would expect to see there, which is some people on the right saying, boo-hoo, libs, cry more. We censured Schiff. And my response to that was, yeah, liberals aren't crying. What they're saying is, as I said, well, that's going to be good for his campaign efforts. Just like the two members of the Tennessee legislature who were cast out and then were immediately put back in, right? Censuring sometimes is humiliating, and often actually people who are censured feel the need to resign their seat because of the humiliation of it. But very often those people are reelected, and they're reelected overwhelmingly, so that not only do they come right back to where they began, but they come back with something of a mandate. And that's certainly the case with Joshua Giddings. Let me get to the numbers and the details here. Joshua Giddings was the person I was thinking of when I made that little tweet about coming back. Getting censured is sometimes a gift to the person being censured. And as I said, many liberals are already saying that without even necessarily knowing the history of it. But Joshua Giddings, very assertive abolitionist in Congress, in the House, 1830s, 1840s. And in 1842, he gets censured for essentially violating the gag rule. There had been a revolt of enslaved people on a ship called the Creole, and Giddings stood up and said something about how, there was nothing wrong with that revolt happening. Of course it should happen. Like, people had a right to stand up and fight for their freedom. And here, his words were, the persons on board the Creole, in resuming their natural rights of personal liberty, violated no law of the United States, incurred no legal penalty, and are justly liable to no penalty. And the United States had no right to regain possession of or to re-enslave the people who were on the Creole. And any attempt to do that, because that was part of what was being argued in Congress, was that, well, we're just re-enslave them because that's their property, their American property. And Giddings says any attempt to do that would reflect American complicity with the illegal international slave trade. So he stands up and does that. In doing that, he violates the gag rule, and he's censured. And it's fascinating when you read, and I talk about it some in my book, you read John Quincy Adams's diary. So apparently he says to Giddings, when Giddings first comes to the house, look, the Southerners are going to storm and rave and stamp and threaten, and just ignore them. Like, it's what they do, and it can't hurt you. And then all of a sudden, Giddings is censured, and he's censured by people, Southerners, and people who, I suppose, dough faces who agree with the Southerners and don't want the slavery issue or to be talked about, don't want the gag rule violated, have all kinds of meanderings with the parliamentary rules, so that Giddings never gets a chance to speak in his own defense. He's silenced by the rules and then censured. And Adams is stunned. And I think he says something like, I can find no words about what just happened, in part because a censure is humiliating. Giddings has been censured. And again, most people who are censured in this time period resign. So Adams is stunned that this happened. And I talked about this once before. So Giddings runs again for his seat. While he's running, there are all kinds of town meetings issuing resolutions that were applauding what he did, applauding his anti-slavery sentiments, denouncing the violation of their rights, because the gag rule, and I talked about this before with the gag rule, Northerners were upset at the gag rule, not always because of the issue of slavery, but because they felt that their rights to speak out or to be represented on the floor were being violated because their representatives were being silenced. So some of Giddings' constituents say that, you know, the censure, quote, insults the whole North. So Giddings is reelected by overwhelming numbers, 7,464 votes to 393. Comes back with a mandate. And actually, Henry Wise, I believe, says it's the greatest triumph achieved by a member of the House, right? It's like, dag nabbit, like, we thought we got rid of him, and now he's back stronger than ever. So censure, on the one hand, it's supposed to be humiliating and can be. On the other hand, depending on how it works and who does it and the circumstances, can be a real gift to the person being censured, which should be taken into account when you're doing that kind of a performative gesture, which is what this is. So we'll see, you know, how it plays out. I think Schiff himself is saying, what a gift. Thank you so much for giving me this gift. We'll see, but that is indeed true, for all of the reasons I just mentioned about the performative nature of censures. Same thing, there are any number of other people who maybe aren't formally censured, but are slapped in one way or another. Their hand is slapped. And as one of them says, Anson Burlingame, I believe in the Senate at one point, writes to his wife, and he's campaigning and people are rushing out to see him. And he didn't stand down when, after the caning of Sumner, when Preston Brooks wanted to fight a duel with him. Burlingame expressed his willingness, and many Northerners were upset at that, but many more Northerners were thrilled that he was going to stand up to the Southerners. Burlingame writes to his wife and says, the whole population of the West seems wild to see your naughty husband, right? So he's like, I stood up and I did the brave, bold thing. I kind of, you know, did something that Northerners shouldn't like, and kind of broke rules of some kind or another. And boy, do people like it. So, and he's praised, right? And there are all kinds of meetings with people praising him as, quote, a gentleman who believed in the defense of freedom and also in self-defense. Yay, he's fighting for us. So that performative component, censure, is humiliating. It is serious. I don't mean to say it isn't, but it can backfire in interesting ways. Now let's talk for a minute about expunging things. That was the other thing that was discussed at some point this past week. And I believe it's Marjorie Taylor Greene who raised the idea of expunging former President Trump's impeachment from the record. Now, so what does that mean? You know, formally speaking, that would mean striking it from the record. That's complicated. And there was an expungement. There was an example I wanted to offer you to compare with this. And the reason why it's different is noteworthy as to why this is complicated. So in the case of Andrew Jackson, he actually is censured at one point. He is doing things with the Bank of the United States that Whigs in Congress do not like, and they have the numbers there. And I think I have the quote here. They censure him. Yes. The Senate votes 26-20 that says the president, Jackson, in the late executive proceeding in relation to the public revenue has assumed upon himself authority and power not conferred by the Constitution and laws, but in derogation of both. So they essentially censure him and say what he did is not allowed. Bad president. What happened? So that's trying to think how long it takes. 1834. I believe it takes 3 years for them to expunge that from the record, and they do. Democrats fight to get that censure of Jackson expunged from the record, and ultimately, 3 years later, it is. And I have to describe to you what happens because it's very dramatic. Okay, so the record is very dramatically brought into the room, the congressional record, the big notebook thing, placed in front of the Senate chamber. And then I assume the clerk crosses out the phrase, the language that in effect was censuring Jackson. It's like, no, it's gone. We're crossing it out. Let's see if I can find the language because it's wonderful. Oh, here. They wrote next to the cross out, expunged by order of the Senate the 16th day of January in the year of our Lord 1837. And apparently there's cheers of the Senate, and they take the pen and they give it as a gift to Andrew Jackson. So there's a case in which Jackson was effectively censured, and ultimately that's expunged from the record, which means it's literally crossed out. Now, the difference between that and supposedly expunging impeachments from the record is that, number one, impeachment doesn't take place in just the House. So even if this happens and the House crosses it out from the record, the impeachment still happened. It didn't just happen in the House. It's the Senate that was actually doing the trial and the impeachment. So whatever goes on and whatever people decide to do, striking the impeachment from the record of the House doesn't really do anything, right? It's performative. But here's the thing about that performance. I want to find it here. There we go. So a number of congressional scholars say, and this is one of them named Josh Shavitz, who's very worthwhile following on whatever social media platform you're on, because he's actually quite good on Congress. He says that expungement resolution wouldn't actually change anything, except it would constitute a sort of statement in relatively strong language by the House that it doesn't think that they should have impeached Trump in the first place. That's all it would be. It would be a performative statement saying, we don't like the fact that the former president was impeached. However, I've written this in bold, there would be nothing stopping Trump and his allies from simply claiming that the impeachments were expunged in the legal sense. They're gone, right? And you could see it, given the climate we live in of lies. I'm not going to even be nice about it. That if it gets expunged from the House record, some on the right are going to say, well, look at that. The impeachments were expunged. They're gone. They never happened. And there will be all kinds of people, including me, saying, yeah, they did. And in this case, you can't just erase it. It's not something that the House did. And it's on other records. So no, you can't make the impeachment go away. I've also seen people, actually, I believe I saw footage of, oh no, it was of the censure. I think I was searching this morning for all kinds of footage so that I could see people say the things that I'm claiming that they are saying. But in one way or another, expunging the record, in part because, as someone claimed, and I want to say it's Marjorie Taylor Greene, but I'm not sure, that the impeachment was unconstitutional. That resurfaces, right? It's unconstitutional. We're going to expunge it from the record. Now, that drives me up a tree, right? It's in the frickin' Constitution. It's not unconstitutional. And at one point, Brian Williams had me on the 11th hour explicitly to say that, right? And somewhere I have a photo. If I can find it, I'll send it out on social media platforms. A photo of my face. I don't know, someone else must have taken it for me. When Brian Williams said, like with a little smile on his face, "Now, Professor Freeman, is impeachment unconstitutional?" And, I essentially responded by saying, yeah, no, it's in the Constitution. But my face was like, yeah, no, it's in the Constitution. So that's rising again. But you can see the performative act of doing that, expunging something, can matter in ways it shouldn't, but might. Same way with Jackson, although in that case, it actually was crossed off the record, and in a sense, it went away. Again, these are somewhat symbolic and also performative. Oh, and I wanted to mention this, and you'll see why in a few minutes. Even Thomas Jefferson kind of got in on this idea of semi-censuring. In this case, Hamilton. In 1793, and by that point, it's late 1792, when it becomes very clear that Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison are really at odds. It's in late September 1792, or that Jefferson starts talking about it. It's in May of 1792 that Hamilton writes a very long letter to a colleague in Virginia explaining what's going on. 1793, it's getting ugly. And you get the Giles resolutions. In 1793, William Branch Giles of Virginia introduces resolutions in Congress, a number of them basically accusing Hamilton of doing a variety of different improper or illegal, or one way or another, he behaved badly as Secretary of the Treasury. He did things he wasn't supposed to do. And according to the draft of these resolutions, so Jefferson, he was in on this, although he stayed behind the scenes. There's a draft of these resolutions in his hand. And I think there are 10 resolutions. And the last one says, resolved that the Secretary of the Treasury has been guilty of maladministration in the duties of his office, and should, in the opinion of Congress, be removed from his office by the President of the United States. Wow. So that's, not only is that sort of censuring, like he has been guilty of maladministration, and by passing these resolutions, it would be saying, yeah, you behaved improperly, and we're going to tell the president we think he should remove him from office. Now, it doesn't happen. And Hamilton, in a typical Hamilton move, writes, defends himself with huge, long reports, acknowledges some things that he did, that he thinks he had reason to do that might fall into the category of what they're censuring, but in no way does it justify what they're doing here, and nothing ultimately happens. But even then, what you see is a partisan, partly performative effort to get Hamilton out of the way, to make him look bad. They published the resolutions, the Jeffersonian Republicans published them in a newspaper. Hey, look what we just did, right? Perform. Look, he's really a corrupt, bad guy. And nothing ultimately happens. I want to make sure I get to the end here. My notes are not in order, and that is a problem. Oh, the last thing I just want to mention, and in this case, it wasn't performative as much as the performance is revealing. And that is the case of Greene calling Bobert supposedly a little bitch. So apparently, so Greene had articles of impeachment against President Biden, and she accused Bobert of stealing her idea and stealing her articles of impeachment and getting credit for it. Now, in this case, Bobert actually says something which, it's not the only time I say this, I vaguely approve of, yeah. And Mug will be coming shortly, I promise. So Greene says, Bobert basically copied my articles and then introduced them and then changed them to a privilege resolution Of course I support them because they're identical to mine. They're basically a copycat. And calls her a little bitch. Why? Because the resolutions are a performance. They're a cry for credit and attention that Green started and Boebert used, right? And that's basically all, whatever they're doing, that's what it's about. This performative aspect of impeachments and expunging and censure, all of this stuff. Again, you need to look at the circumstances. You can't say all of it, of all kinds, ever is fake, but some of them are very clearly performative and little else. And so Green's upset because Boebert, according to her, took her limelight. Boebert actually says in response to this, she's asked, what do you think of this claim that you copied her and she called you a bitch? And Boebert apparently said something like, I'm not in middle school, which I kind of like, I will admit. It's probably the only time I ever say that. Anyway, so what I wanted to end by saying, and then the mug will come, that now obviously I've said the word performative about 800 times. The performative component of it is very important. As with everything, when I tell you don't get emotional, when you see something that makes you want to be emotional, pause for a moment, consider what people want you to do, what they want to happen. Same thing goes with all of these seemingly parliamentary measures. Rules are important. They do important things. They can also be manipulated to make a statement. So whenever you see something like this, any of these things that happen, the expunging or the censure, rather than just assuming what it means, ooh, it's corruption. In some cases it might be, but in some cases it isn't. Think about what the performance means. Who's suggesting it? Why are they suggesting it? Is there anything to the claims? And is there some way in which this might be personal or partisan and nothing else? It's important, right? It requires thought, which is part of why if the record is expunged, Republicans, or at least some of them will be saying, you know, oh, it was expunged, the impeachments are gone. And it will be easy to believe that if you don't think about it for very long. The other thing I will say too, which I've said many other times, is that words matter, right? They do. They matter when you're performing them. They have an impact. Always think about the impact of these sorts of gestures. Always think about the potential outcomes of these kinds of performative gestures. And always be aware, as well as you can be, of the rules and the Constitution. Because you can claim anything is against the rules, but it might not be, right? It's just you making a claim like impeachment is unconstitutional. I swear, makes me want to bang my head against the wall. Okay, I'm going very long. I will stop. But anyway, that's part of what I'm claiming today. Consider the purpose and outcome, potential outcomes of these kinds of gestures. Accountability does matter, but so do the circumstances and the particulars. So remember performance in addition to possible actual significance. Okay, the mug. You will see why I felt the need to bring Jefferson in, to rope Jefferson in. Okay, it's on both sides. This is good. And I think this is you, Annie. I think you gave me this mug. It says, Burr shot first, Hamilton shot first. I don't know what you heard, but whatever it is, Jefferson started it.
That was me 2 weeks in a row because you used my Monticello mug last week, I think.
Okay.
Well, I got a mug twofer.
You got a mug twofer. This, whatever it is, Jefferson started it. I saw it in my cupboard and I was like, yep, okay, there it is. Like Hamilton having a moment. In this case, Jefferson certainly was in on the start of it. So, okay.
It made me laugh. It made me think of something my middle school students would say. He started it first.
I know. Well, that's the eternal thing you say about your siblings too. Well,
Yes.
he started it. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we've got some great questions ready to go in the Q&A. And I am going to start off with one from Bailey. Our friend Bailey Paletti asks, did the founders, early Republic politicians compare or contrast congressional performance with performance in foreign bodies such as Parliament? And if so, was that done in positive or negative ways?
Repeat the first part of that question.
She was wondering if the early founders would compare their congressional performance with those of other foreign countries, especially in the beginning when we were so new.
Well, so I have two parts to that answer. Part of the answer is they were definitely looking at Parliament, right, which was their former national legislature of sorts, to see what it did. They weren't always sure if they should be or shouldn't be doing what Parliament did, because on the one hand, it was like as Hamilton put it, the greatest government on the face of the earth. On the other hand, they'd just broken away from it and were trying to do something that they considered to be better. So for sure, they were comparing and contrasting whatever they did in Congress with whatever happened in England in Parliament, and then having these fierce, weird, in my mind, somewhat amusing arguments about like, well, they do this there, and then someone else saying, is that good or bad? Does that mean we should do it or we shouldn't do it? The other half of that question, though, is I did a little bit of comparison when I was working on this book, early on in working on this book. One of the questions that occurred to me was, how does the US Congress compare with Parliament when it comes to threats and violence and the behavior that I'm writing about? And not surprisingly, the American Congress is more physically violent than Parliament, right? Particularly the House of Commons. There was foot stamping and hat throwing and yelling and whatever, but members of Parliament, first of all, socially, as far as their social status goes, were very near each other. So you would see a lot, like some episode happen in maybe the House of Commons, and then they would go off and have a beer together, number one. Number two, you just didn't see people slugging each other or pulling weapons on each other. In the olden days, there's the old saying about how the two sides of the room of Parliament had to be 2 swords lengths apart to keep members from one side away from the other. That may be true, that may not be true, but that in the Parliament of the Founders era and on into the early 19th century, they were performing and they were getting angry, and occasionally there was a duel or threat of a duel. But as a British colleague of mine put it, you don't see a lot of blood on the carpet in Parliament. In the United States Congress, sometimes you do. So it was much more violent here than it is over there. But interestingly, I once found, I believe, a newspaper editorial and also a member of Congress, which both said essentially the same thing, which was something along the lines of, can you believe what they do over there in Parliament? When someone tries to speak and they don't like it, they stamp their feet and bang the table so no one can hear them. How outrageous! How horrible! I think it's so much better here, in parentheses, where we threaten to smack each other around. I love the fact that that was seen, as barbaric by US congressmen in the first half of the 19th century.
Wow. Did they ever pull each other's wigs off, though?
Did what?
Ask, did they ever pull the wigs off? That they in England, they wear the wigs. Was there a lot of wigs?
There was not. I do not believe there was wig snatching, and wigs go away at some point in the late 18th century. So except with barristers in England, right?
They still wear them, which I think is odd, but
yeah.
Who am I, Annie Evans, on the other side of the pond to judge? Okay, our good friend Bobby.
Totally irrelevant, but I will mention it only. Wigs went away, but they were powdering their hair so that they looked white-ish, which is why sometimes people talk about, people wearing a wig. And it's like, no, they were just powdering their hair. Okay, I will now stop with irrelevant things and we go back to
I'm very itchy. So Bobby asked, who might be feeding these ideas like expungement to the members who don't seem to know much about our deep history or how our government works? Who seems to be enabling these people calling for censure and expungement and all of that?
Well, so my answer without rummaging around would just be, it's the group of MAGA extremists who were angry about McCarthy in the first place and who are united in some way or another and are trying to come up with ways to obstruct and insult and score points, whether they're viable and believable or not. I don't know who the brains are behind that operation. I couldn't tell you, but it's clear it's a in one way or another, it's a group endeavor, trying to score points in part on the part of Green with Trump, which she's always trying to score points with in some way or another, but also, again, to perform these, seemingly horrible accusations in public so that then things can happen and people can claim things happened when actually nothing happened, but people spoke a lot of words.
A lot of words.
I
Okay,
know.
are fairly recent, but been coming for several weeks now. So I feel like you're just part of the family now. Sydney asks, why are these performative speeches and public feuds so appealing to people? How does this affect politics and the view of politics in general?
Well, I mean, so part of the answer to that is depending on who's making the performance and the people who are watching, it gives you the impression that the member of Congress is fighting for you, right? You get up and you make this bold speech, or you make an accusation and wave your fists around. And regardless of whether it's true or credible or realistic or entirely invented and nonsensical, you can give the impression that you're fighting for your base. And that's appealing. This is the very aspect of, it's something I've been writing about in one way or another in recent weeks, I guess. And I've talked about it before here, that one of the things that most worried the founding generation about our form of government, which is a more democratic, small d form of government, democratic republic, was that in a democratic government, the public opinion rules, the people rule. And the scary part about that is they can be convinced, warped, corrupted emotionally by someone who's just very skilled at that. Someone who can get up in front of the public or in front of Congress aiming at the public and say something maybe persuasively, full of lies, but persuasively, and can sway parts of the public to believe them and act. That's part of what terrified the founding generation about our form of government. It's good because it's grounded on the people, it's grounded on public opinion, it is not a monarchy for all kinds of reasons. And again, the people is a small group, but still, in this time period. For all of those reasons, it's good, but for that very reason, it's vulnerable because the public, Hamilton uses the word corrupted, right? At some point after Federalists lose the election of 1800, it's either 1801 or 1802, Hamilton writes a letter in which he says, so what did the Republicans do that we didn't do? And I think he writes the word corrupt in capital letters. Corrupt the public. That's what they did. And then comes up with a plan in which the Federalists can corrupt the public by making claims and making performative things and writing resolutions and doing everything else. So it's part of our form of government. It was an intimidating part for some people. It was a vulnerability. It's also a good thing about our form of government. It matters that we matter, that the public matters, right? That's democracy. But that's why demagogues are threats, serious threats, and that fear of demagogues goes all the way back. That's what a demagogue does. Appeals and panders and makes all kinds of claims and then gets into power and does whatever the heck he or she wants to do.
Yeah. The chat is lit up. Okay, we will get to that at the after party.
I know, I can't even keep up with it.
No, I'm trying to. Okay, our good buddy Dale, who lives here in Williamsburg, Virginia, says, in the time period of Field of Blood, were the journalists or others who called out performative antics in Congress for what they were? So were the journalists actively at that point in history calling these people out?
Okay, yes and no. It's very historian-like. Two-part answer. So yes, there were some. Now the congressional record of the period essentially was spin-off publications of newspapers. So the press and the congressional record weren't entirely separate, which means whatever the journalists were doing was more complex than some of what happens today. They couldn't be too insane or else they would discredit whatever they were putting in the record. That said, there would be, and this I've talked before, I'm sure, about the fact that the record rarely mentions bad behavior. It'll say things like, there was a sudden sensation. and they won't explain what that means. Like two guys started to punch each other and flip the table. It's like, yep, that was a sudden sensation. It'll say stuff like that. But if you're going to be specific and you're going to say something like, Congressman Smith stood up and said this or did this or, started a fight, whatever, even if you're not using inflammatory language, you take a risk, because if you're going to say that in the press about the kind of member of Congress who would do that, they're going to come for you. So there are journalists who are beaten in the House by the member of Congress who they say something negative about in the press. Like so-and-so stood up and did this and he shouldn't have done it. And then I can't now even remember which congressman and which member of the press, but a reporter is caned I think in the press gallery of the House, I believe. And as ever, people hold people back because it's fair, right? So that the journalist said something bad and fellow who feels insulted should have a chance to redeem himself by caning a reporter. There's a really, I found, amazing incident involving something like this, in which there's a member of Congress who, let's see, two journalists together work for the same newspaper, and they say something negative about this member of Congress. And again, not even crazy, they just acknowledge that he did, something bad. And the congressman stands up and essentially says, like, you're going to be sorry. These two guys are going to be sorry. One of the journalists says that member of Congress has, quote, an alarming physique. So he's a big guy. So the journalists arm themselves just in case, in case this guy comes after them, but they do something ingenious. They stop reporting him. They don't include him in the record. They don't talk about him in the newspaper. He's gone. And after a not very long amount of time, he apologizes to the reporters, because what matters, again, performative, is the performance. It's what people see. And the journalists had that power. I love that incident. These journalists being like, oh yeah, guess what? Oof, you're gone. Anyway, so yes, there were people calling it out. And also the newspapers in this period were not necessarily always credible. The amount of time it took sometimes for me to decide that something actually happened. I mean, the effort. I'd see it in a newspaper, and I'd look at another newspaper, and I'd look at 3 other newspapers, and then I would look in the congressional record, and then I would look at diaries, and then I would pool all this together to try and decide if something actually happened. So the press, there was a lot going on in the press, and it was hard to know what was true and what wasn't true, even with the Telegraph.
All right, this is a long question. Okay, this is from our good friend Dave. Dave says, behaving badly on the floor of the House or Senate is surely often performative, but censure, he thought, was a serious action specified in the Constitution. He agrees in the case of Schiff, it would benefit him politically. How often have House members been censured in the last 40 to 50 years? He said, it seems like it doesn't happen often. If the Schiff example is illustrative, how does censuring not make the House look like a non-serious body, like a clown show?
So in other words, does censuring make the House look like a clown show?
Doing it in a performative way.
In a performative way. Well, it is serious.
Mentions like George Santos.
Right. It is serious. It's supposed to be serious. And it's supposed to be shaming, right? Which is why in the 19th century, if you were censured, you resigned. I have been censured. I have been, in one way or another shamed, and I will go home now. And then often got reelected. So I'm not claiming at all by saying it's performative. I'm not saying, and don't mean to say, it doesn't count and it's not serious. It is, and it does, right? It counts and it is serious. But the circumstances matter, right? The charges matter. Who introduced them matter. Their credibility matters. So a censure is significant. And if you have the votes for it, right, you can do it, which is what happened in the House. So then the question becomes, what was Schiff being censured for? Did he do the things that he was being censured for? What does that mean? I mean, then it actually requires some thought as to what's going on and how performative is this. It's performative whether it's serious or not. But censures are, it is something, it is an act a formal act that is taken and voted upon. Right. So it isn't just performative, but it can be done for largely performative reasons. I guess is the way I would differentiate it. I'm trying to catch up here because I see I see some good comments that I'm not going to repeat, but
No, they're going so fast. Okay, our friend
Yeah.
Miranda, who recently launched her own podcast and had her own mug reveal in honor of this group. So I just mentioned that. Miranda asks, was Alexander Stevens ever expunged or just pardoned after the Civil War? She said, I know he was reelected back to the Senate seat during Reconstruction, despite being vice president of the Confederacy.
well, I can't go into absolute detail on this. What I can say is it's a lot going on here with Ukrainian and burping computers, and I'm trying not to look at it. What I can say is that to be reconstructed, members of the Confederacy did have to, many of them at least, had to take some kind of oath of loyalty to the Union, since they had been traitors to the Union. I don't know the specific circumstances with Stevens, so I can't speak to that, but I do know, I know that Henry Wise's politics, for example, changed all over the place, but he refused to take that oath. He refused to be reconstructed. So I don't know, that would probably be, you guys are like the masters of Google, you could probably find that out. But it was an issue. So, you had to do something, generally speaking, to acknowledge that you had been a traitor to the US government, and now you were swearing loyalty to the US government, because that's what the Confederacy did. Regardless of whether people want to praise the Confederacy, they attacked the US government.
All right. That was a good one, Miranda. All right. Linda asks, she said she was watching the House the other day, and it was so contentious, I couldn't handle watching anymore. Is that part of their plan? So in other words, are they trying to make it just so disgusting that we all just turn off C-SPAN and walk away?
I don't think they assume, so as much as I'm saying this is performative, I suppose what I mean by that is they try to do something noteworthy that will get attention. I don't think they assume that the nation is glued to C-SPAN, and I love C-SPAN. I watch C-SPAN. So I'm not saying this to disparage C-SPAN at all, but I don't think whatever's going on is their attempt to make people not watch C-SPAN. I do think whatever's going on might be people attempting to show, I'm fighting for what I believe in, I'm attacking the bad guys, I'm a fighter, I'm fighting for your rights, whatever the messages are that you might be able to promote by being contentious and obnoxious, particularly in the House. That's part of what's going on there more than anything else. But I haven't actually watched, and it's interesting, I haven't watched in a while. It used to be many moons ago, you would sometimes watch the floor of, say, the House, and there would be like a handful of people there, right? The camera would back up and you'd see like, oh, this person is like speechifying. And it's a not an empty room, but boy, is it not a crowded room. And there's a great case in which that's, Buncombe is being addressed in that kind of speech. Anyway, I'll leave it there. That's my kind of two-part answer to that question.
Yeah. Okay. Jen asked, was anyone prevented from serving in Congress under the 14th Amendment? And if not, why not?
I actually cannot answer that question. I just do not have the knowledge in my brain without Googling to answer that question. I will always be the teacher who will admit,
oh, me too,
that is not a thing I know. As a matter of fact, in my lecture courses, I sometimes when that happens, can't say it happens that much, but it does. I will say, I'll come back next week, like with the answer to that question. And I do. But I do not in this case know the answer to that question.
Tim, our Google Meister, might be able to find that for us.
Indeed.
And I have to say, my good friend Lawrence Schmidt, who joins us very frequently, called it in medieval days, he said they had morality plays. Now we have this, I'm going to use the word nonsense because I'm a lady, Lawrence. I'm not going to use the word that you used, but yeah, morality plays. I actually think it's just they can't afford to hire someone to make really good campaign ads, so they just want to get sound bites off C-SPAN and use them.
They want sound bites, right? I mean, so like when I went off researching this morning to try and actually find proof of what it was people were saying or doing, it's there, right? Things are being recorded, whether it's a media outlet or whoever, they can take it, they can get the clip, they can throw it on out there. And we, different episode, but you can clip things or edit things to make them say or do all kinds of things that actually you never intended, but yeah.
Clinton said he's making his own bingo cards he's making his own bingo cards of people who voted against certifying the election on January 6th. And he uses them when he watches C-SPAN.
Wow.
And I already loved you since we got to hang out
Wow.
at AJ, but now I think I love you even more.
I salute that. I do. I salute
like one of my favorite people in this community.
That effort.
Hats off to you. Wigs off to you. Okay, we've only got 2 questions left, but it's 11 o'clock. But we have to clear the deck.
Let's try.
Our good friend Debbie Pomerantz asks, I recall an early objection to C-SPAN was that it would encourage more, theatrics, performative behavior. Have the benefits been worth the costs?
Well, to me, I would say yes. Transparency is good most of the time. And we should be able to see what's going on. And I think sometimes what we see is obnoxious performance, and that's what it's meant to be. And we see that. Hopefully, some people who see that can see it's obnoxious performance, right? So I think it's worth it for us to be able to see what goes on in that room. Even if it's one guy standing with 8 guys and women in the room pontificating about nothingness, I think it's important that we have that ability to see it. I thought it was really good that we got to see trying to elect a speaker in the House. I thought that was wonderful. Not that the event was wonderful, but Americans should be able to see what that was like, how the party in control of the House was acting during it. There was a near fight moment, all of that. I think we should be able to see. And again, I don't know the ratings for C-SPAN, and I'm sure they vary depending on what's going on. Regardless of the ratings, it's important for that, I'm going all the way back like to the founding, where they're like, the public needs to know. I think we have a right to know what goes on in Congress. And it's a very fragmented small piece of what happens in Congress, but I think we should be able to see it.
Yeah, and it's an invaluable teaching tool. I just put that in the chat so it would be part of the transcript for government and civics teachers in particular, but just so many things that we used to struggle to try and explain to kids. We can find those clips. C-SPAN makes it really easy for teachers to clip a little segment of a 5-hour session. So you just get that little teachable moment and you can rename it. And then the nice thing they do is then you can kind of put it out there. And then when other people are searching for that clip, they don't have to waste time making it. They'll say, another C-SPAN user already made that clip. Here you go. If you make it public, which I always do for other teachers. So I love C-SPAN.
I must have said pontificating about nothingness, and I don't remember that, but I approve. Okay.
Dave asked, how often in the last 40, oh wait, we already did that one. The last question goes to Jay Simpson. Jay, I don't know if I have seen your name here before. If you are new, if you've been here before, I apologize. But, or you could have come for weeks and just not asked a question before. He says, will censuring Adam Schiff result in any tangible collateral damage to the Republican conference in the House? Are they handling Representative Schiff, are they handing him the Democratic nomination for Senate that will later lead to Katie Porter free to be reelected her swing seat in Orange County?
Well, certainly, my off-the-cuff response was, I actually tweeted something that said, some on the right, like, boo-hoo, the libs are crying, the Schiff was censured, and then the left, not crying. This will be great for Schiff. It might very well be the sort of thing that will make the left they can use that to campaign with it. They can use it against the right and use it as an example of performative, whatever it is that they want to call it. It might be very good for his campaign. Again, traditionally speaking, over the long haul of American history, that sort of thing in this kind of circumstance where it's not as though, Schiff didn't, well, I'm not even going to go there. I said, people are making all kinds of claims about Schiff, and personally, I don't think he committed any kind of crime that's worth censuring. But regardless of that fact, what we have here is not an example of, of course, someone should have done something. So it's largely performative. And this is the precise kind of case in which it will redound to his credit and win him something. I don't know what that does about everything else, but it very well might. And, I suppose, well, I just don't predict politics anymore. We can predict politics anymore in this climate. You just never know. Okay.
We cleared the deck. We did it, kids.
We cleared the deck. Wonderful. Let me now explain what comes next. So now we are going to go to Sydney. Politics are weird. I'll stand with that. We're now going to go to the after party. What that means is that we will stop recording so that we can be even freer and easier than we are normally here at History Matters. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us at ncheteach.org/conversations, ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too will poof, be in the after party. Thank you as ever for being here for the conversation of democracy as we do this week by week. It's really important to be able to talk about these very things precisely. This week I was like, I didn't have a hard time coming up with a topic, particularly when something happens and they need unpacking. And we do that here. We ask questions, we talk about it. It's so important in the same way that I think it's important that we can see what happens in Congress. It's important that we can be here as a group and talk about events and outcomes and implications. It's so important. And so, as ever, this is the best community in the world, and what we do here matters. I want to say thank you to Annie. I want to say thank you to John. I will see you guys in a week. And I don't want to wish that there's something obvious to talk about, because that might not be good for us. So we'll just see what happens. But thank you. All the little emoji things calling up the sleeve. I easily get topics when the house is in session. It does help. At any rate, I will see you guys all in a week. Have a good week. Be safe and happy. And see you soon. And now we will wait.